The land before the flag. Before America had a name, America wasn't born on the 4th of July. It was carved, claimed, stolen, and stitched together long before fireworks lit the sky. Imagine a continent not yet called America, no borders, no states, no constitution, just vast, living land, stretching from icy tundra to sunburned deserts, from swampy marshes to towering forests. And across it, millions of people, indigenous nations, ancient cultures, empires that rose and fell in silence. Before the ink dried on any declaration, this land was already old. The first Americans didn't cross a sea in tall ships. They came thousands of years earlier across a land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska. They were hunters, dreamers, and builders, and they came long before discovery was a word Europeans used. In the Mississippi Valley, massive earthen mounds rose from the ground, built by the Mississippian civilization, whose city of Cahokia once rivaled London in size. In the southwest, the ancestral Pueblones crafted cliffside dwellings that defied erosion and time. In the northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy practiced a sophisticated form of democracy that would later inspire the U.S. Constitution. Though history often forgets to mention it, there were hundreds of nations, hundreds of languages, a kaleidoscope of cultures, spiritual, scientific, seasonal, political. They traded across rivers and mountains. They fought. They allied. They adapted to their environments with more wisdom than most empires ever would. And then the world shifted. The 15th century brought sails to the horizon. European kingdoms, driven by gold, God, and glory, turned their compasses west. But when they found land, they didn't just plant flags. They brought disease, steel, and conquest. In 1492, Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean, not on the U.S. mainland, but it unleashed a tidal wave of colonization. Spanish explorers claimed Florida. French traders moved through the Mississippi River, and by the early 1600s, the English set foot in Virginia, hungry for land and profit. The age of indigenous autonomy was ending, not with a war, but with waves of disease that decimated up to 90% of native populations, before most Europeans ever saw them face to face. The land was not empty, it had been emptied. And in this silent catastrophe, a myth was born that America was wilderness, that it needed civilization, that it belonged to someone else now. But the people were still here, resisting, adapting, surviving. Meanwhile, new settlements took root. In 1607, Jamestown became the first permanent English colony. It was supposed to be a gold mine. Instead, it was a graveyard. Hunger, infighting, and disease nearly wiped it out. Only tobacco and enslaved labor would save it. Then came Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, Puritans, Pilgrims, and idealists seeking religious freedom, but only for themselves. By 1700, the eastern seaboard was dotted with colonies, to 13 of them by name, but each with its own laws, dialects, prejudices, and economic ambitions. What they shared was tension with native tribes, with each other, and most of all, with the distant empire that claimed to rule them. This was not yet America. But the seeds were there, different people, different ideals, unequal from the start, bound not by unity, but by survival, and the quiet drumbeat of change. Because across the sea, a king was tightening his grip, and across the land, whispers of revolution were beginning to stir. By the early 1700s, the British colonies on the Atlantic coast were thriving, at least on paper. 13 colonial outposts stretched from New Hampshire to Georgia, each with its own laws, currency, and way of life. They were like siblings in a massive, dysfunctional family, all answering to the same distant parent, the British Crown. Virginia was rich from tobacco. Massachusetts was a Puritan stronghold. New York was built on trade, and Pennsylvania was founded by a Quaker who just wanted everyone to calm down. But they had more in common than they realized. They all worked the land, sometimes with their own hands, often with the hands of enslaved Africans. They all depended on trade, with Britain, with the Caribbean, and with each other. They all feared native resistance, pirate attacks, and the cold breath of famine. And they all paid taxes to a king they'd never seen. At first, it wasn't so bad. Britain's hands-off approach, known as salutary neglect, let the colonies run things their own way. Local assemblies made laws. Town meetings buzzed with arguments. Colonial newspapers, some barely legible, lit up with opinions, but underneath the surface, resentment was growing. Then came the French and Indian War 175 for 1763. Britain and France, along with their native allies, fought a brutal war for control of North America. The British won, and with victory came land. Lots of it, but also debt. Britain turned to the colonies and said, essentially, we defended you, you helped pay for it. Cue outrage. The Stamp Act 1765 taxed paper, newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards, all stamped and taxed. Colonists rioted, boycotted, burned effigies, and muttered about tyranny in taverns. The Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, and the Quartering Act followed. Each law tightened Britain's grip. Each one loosened colonial loyalty. And then, one night in 1770, things snapped. British soldiers opened fire on a crowd in Boston. 5 colonists died. It was called the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere made a famous engraving. It went viral, colonial style. The tension was now public and permanent, but the real tea was literal tea. In 1773, colonists dressed as Mohawk warriors boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of British tea into the water. Not a protest, a statement. London was furious. Parliament passed the Coercive Acts. Colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. Boston's port was shut down. Local governments were dissolved. Troops marched into homes. And in 1774, colonial leaders met for the First Continental Congress. It wasn't yet rebellion, but it was a warning shot. The colonies, divided by region, religion, and economy, were starting to see themselves as something more than British subjects, not quite Americans, but something different, something becoming. By 1775, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. Farmers with muskets stood against red-coated regulars. Nobody knew who fired first, but blood was spilled, and the war had begun. Not a war for independence, not yet, but a war for dignity, for self-rule, for the right to be heard. When rebels became a nation, it wasn't supposed to go this far. The colonies weren't aiming for independence, not at first. They wanted respect, autonomy, a voice in the empire they'd helped expand. They saw themselves as loyal British citizens, just badly treated ones. But by 1776, that loyalty had snapped like a frozen river in spring. War had already broken out. Blood was shed at Lexington and Concord. At Bunker Hill, colonists lost the ground, but proved they could wound the empire. George Washington, a tall, soft-spoken Virginian, was chosen to command the Continental Army. Still, many hoped for peace. And then came a pamphlet that lit the fuse. Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, exploded across the colonies in January 1776. It was written not for scholars or kings, but for farmers, blacksmiths, and bakers. It said things plainly. There is something absurd, Paine wrote, in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. Boom, his words spread like wildfire. Within months, over 100,000 copies were circulating, an astronomical number for the time. People began to say the unthinkable. We don't want reconciliation. We want a new country. That summer, delegates gathered in Philadelphia in a stuffy hall filled with heat, sweat, and nerves. The Second Continental Congress debated the unthinkable. Should they break with Britain? On July 2nd, the vote was unanimous. On July 4th, the document was approved. And on July 8th, it was read aloud to a stunned public, the Declaration of Independence. Penned by Thomas Jefferson, edited by Ben Franklin and John Adams, and signed by men who knew it might cost them their lives. It wasn't just a list of grievances. It was a manifesto, a thunderclap, a rebirth. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Words that would echo for centuries, even when the nation failed to live up to them. But signing a piece of paper doesn't make you a country. Now they had to fight. The war raged across valleys, rivers, and frozen fields. Washington's army was underfed, undertrained, and constantly on the run. At one point, he had fewer than 2,000 men, barefoot, freezing, starving. But then came Trenton, Saratoga, Valley Forge, moments of grit, flashes of hope. And in 1778, a miracle, France joined the fight. Why? Because they hated Britain. But also, they saw something stirring, a new kind of rebellion. A people rising, not just to overthrow a king, but to build something brand new. The war turned. By 1781, Washington, with help from the French, cornered British General Cornwallis at Yorktown. Cannons roared. Redcoats surrendered. The empire blinked. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the United States of America, 13 colonies. Now 13 states, independent, bruised, but alive. The revolution was over. Or so they thought. Because winning independence is one thing. Figuring out what to do with it? That's the real war. The nation that almost wasn't, you'd think. After beating the most powerful empire on earth, America would walk proudly into the future, flags waving. Freedom blazing, destiny clear. Nope. After 1783, the newly independent United States was a hot mess. 13 states, 13 currencies, 13 armies. No king, no central government, just a loose handshake called the Articles of Confederation. It was like organizing a national barbecue where nobody brought food, everyone brought their own grill, and no one agreed on who's flipping the burgers. There was no president, no federal court system. Congress couldn't even collect taxes. If it needed money, it had to ask the states nicely and hope they felt generous. They didn't. It wasn't a country. It was a group chat, constantly glitching. Economy in shambles. Foreign threats everywhere. Local rebellions. Oh yes. In 1786, a veteran farmer named Daniel Shays led an armed uprising in Massachusetts over debt and taxes. Angry mobs stormed courthouses. The government, such as it was, panicked. Shays' rebellion made one thing painfully clear: we just won a war, and now we might lose peace. The elite were scared. Ordinary folks were frustrated. Something had to give. So, in 1787, delegates from 12 states Rhode Island ghosted, gathered in Philadelphia to fix the Articles. What they did instead was scrap them entirely. In a sweltering room, with windows shut to keep out eavesdroppers, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin, and others began hammering out a brand new government. One with checks and balances, with executive power, a president, with a legislature, a judiciary, with rules. It wasn't smooth. Fists nearly flew. Tempers flared. Slavery? Swept under the rug. Small states versus big states. Ugly. The final version wasn't perfect. Far from it. But it was functional. The U.S. Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787. It began with 3 now famous words. We the people, words that rang with promise and hypocrisy, because the people didn't include women or black Americans or native tribes or the poor. But for the first time, a government wasn't based on royal blood. It was based on paper and power sharing. In 1789, George Washington was sworn in as the first president. No throne, no crown, just a simple oath. The United States of America, barely out of diapers, was now officially a nation, fragile, flawed, and full of contradictions, but the world was watching. Next, a country expands, explodes, and nearly tears itself apart. What lies west of the Mississippi, and what happens when freedom isn't for everyone? That was just the beginning. Part 2 reveals the bold, brutal path from coast to coast, and the people left behind in the name of progress. Subscribe to Leevano Chronicles, where we uncover the real, raw history they didn't teach you in school.